Mr. Spirek, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce you, and I'm just gonna lay the foundation, I guess, for today. So, for those who don't know, Mr. Spirek talked to us last year. He earned his master's in nautical archaeology from East Carolina in 1991. He is the state underwater archaeologist at the South Carolina Institute for Archeology and Anthropology, mainly involved with the subdivision of the Maritime Research Division. They're the same group that gives out the hobby licenses, which I have here. This is mine. Mr. Spirek's experience has led him to Alabama, North Carolina, and obviously South Carolina and Florida, where he spent multiple years working at the shipwreck survey. And Mr. Spirek, so I'm gonna mute the so that way the ambience in the classroom doesn't distract you. If you do have any questions, I'll come and wave you down and unmute. Yes, sir. That said, I'm gonna mute the classroom, and we're in here until 1:15. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll be the moderator. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Addison. For my presentation today, I wanted to focus on our various regulatory and research components of our state underwater archaeology program. And for those of you who may have been in the spring lecture, my colleague and I focused on the Underwater Antiquities Act as one of our guiding pieces of legislation, along with the Enabling Act that created SCIAA in the first place. But in this case, I wanted to broaden the presentation to focus on more on all the facets that we work on here in the state. And in this time also to show an illustrated presentation this time, as archaeology really likes to have slides of pretty artifacts and shipwrecks and things of that nature. So hopefully you'll be able to see some of the work, just get a basic understanding of the various things that we do here in underwater archaeology, I know, which is also a subset of of the Paleontology Law Coalition. So a very broad umbrella, but for us, the legislation or the discovery in 1968 of the Georgiana Mary Bowers, there were two wrecked Civil War blockaders off Charleston Harbor. They were discovered, as I mentioned, in 1968, and this instigated the creation of the South Carolina Underwater Antiquities Act, which really was geared towards, protecting the salvors' rights, in which it gave a 50-50 distribution between the state and the salvors. And over the years, this law has been amended to better preserve and protect all underwater archaeological sites in state waters that range from prehistoric and historic dugout canoes, small wooden sailing vessels, warships, blockade runners, along with the various infrastructure such as ferry landings, wharves and piers, shipyards, and other structures, sites, and objects of potential archaeological and historical significance. The Underwater Archaeology Division, which is now known as the Maritime Research Division, was created in 1975 with the hiring of the first state underwater archaeologist. And so, as underwater archaeologists, we conceptualize the state by its water bodies, so the rivers and lakes, and the ocean in our jurisdiction is out to 3 nautical miles. And then after that, you're into federal waters. And over the years, we've investigated numerous watercraft related to navigating along these waterways. And of course, other related maritime features, as I mentioned earlier, ferry crossings, mills, shipyards, and especially eroding prehistoric sites that are eroding along the banks of the rivers, and which is also one of the draws, as Addison mentioned, about the hobby licenses of divers wanting to collect material that's eroding into the river, whether it's prehistoric, Native Americans, and then of course, colonial endeavors as well. So we've been involved with numerous large-scale operations throughout that time period. The first that was involved with the Underwater Archaeology Division was in 1976, when they recovered a small wooden sailing vessel that was completely filled with brick in 1976. And it was just above Georgetown in the Blackwater River, and was called the Browns Ferry vessel. It wasn't a ferry vessel, it just sank at Browns Ferry, and hence the name. And it was a local wooden vessel. It was declared very important because it sort of showed that the Southern colonists were building ships as well. It wasn't just all their Yankee counterparts doing the building, but that the fact there was a vibrant colonial shipbuilding tradition going on here in South Carolina. And so that the vessel, excuse me, was recovered and then conserved. And then if you ever go to Georgetown, I encourage you to go to the Rice Museum, where it's on display on the 3rd floor. And then as well, and which has display materials of some of the artifacts that were recovered as well. And then if you go over to the South Carolina Maritime Museum, which is right next door practically, it's also got some material from the shipwreck, as well as like the reconstruction of the vessel as a square transom, a small sailing vessel, probably one mast, maybe two masts, that would have just probably been used to go from Georgetown area to Charleston with this load of bricks, was probably where it was destined to go. In 1995, SCIAA participated in the discovery of the H.L. Hunley, along with the novelist Clive Cussler and his organization. And then we're involved in subsequent investigations, as well as the recovery in 2000. So that submarine, if you haven't seen that, again, encourage you all to go take a look at that. It's on display on the weekends primarily. And at North Charleston at the Warren Losh Conservation Center. And it's been undergoing conservation now for 22 years. And a lot of the artifacts have been conserved, and it's just a matter of conserving the submarine itself, which is actively undergoing conservation now. It's been about 5 years or so. It's probably got a little while longer before it would move to a museum here and hopefully in the immediate future. We've also been involved in smaller projects, such as a recovery of prehistoric and historic dugout canoes. And this imagery here shows a canoe where we oftentimes don't go to work, up in the mountains or in the upcountry or the upstate, where we have some kayakers discovered the canoe. You can just see it in the upper image, just barely protruding out of the sediments where it was buried. They had nice cold water, which preserved it pretty well. And conservation, as well as a curation exhibition project, was developed, and the canoe was recovered. And here we can see it being moved up the rapids. Went up the rapids about a mile or so, but before we got to a suitable landing, and then brought up the mountain, and then it's on display. If you ever go to Walhalla, South Carolina, you go to the Oconee History Museum, and it's on display there. So really, that could have been a ferry canoe just moving from, say, Georgia over to South Carolina. And again, it was the Chattooga River. Another canoe was a historic canoe, and this was eroding further south there just on an island south of Defusky Island, so on the southern border of South Carolina. And it was a historic canoe. You can see it nicely shaped there on the upper left image. The nice, actually was like a double ender. The other end looked like that as well. Sort of hard to tell whether, bow or stern. And then here we are digging it. And as in any case with a large hole, there's a lot of dirt that you got to move. So this took quite a bit of time and effort to get the canoe recovered. And then it was brought to Defusky Island. And again, if you go to Defusky Island, go to the Bloody Point Museum, it's on display there. And that was sort of a combination of public and private initiative to do this. So the canoe is still retained by the state, but we're working with a local proprietor who conserved it at his restaurant. So it was sort of on display for diners could take a look at it. And then he brought it to his private museum, which is open to the public as well. So sort of a good combination of resources to preserve this canoe for folks to look at. So besides doing the expected jobs of an underwater archaeologist to recover and investigate shipwrecks and other vessels, that is actually one of the very last resorts that we rely on to preserve the maritime archaeological legacy in the state. So as the state agency, we have several mandates. As I mentioned earlier with the legislation, our Enabling Act that created SCIAA in 1963, and then the creation of the underwater archaeology mandate in the 1970s. And so this is sort of our 6 objects that we try and maintain. So we maintain the state underwater archaeology sites database. We consult with the State Historic Preservation Office that's housed at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. We also administer the South Carolina Underwater Antiquities Act. We conduct archaeological research, and we engage with public interaction. So to meet these legislated responsibility, the Maritime Research Division consists of 3 staff members, myself as the state underwater archaeologist, Athena Van Overscheld as an underwater archaeologist who oversees our regulatory responsibilities, who's on your right, and William Nassif, an underwater archaeologist and administrator of the hobby licensing, who was my co-presenter at our last presentation with your group. We also augment our numbers as needed with temporary hires, university students, volunteers, and colleagues as needed. We also have 3 small boats, a marine archaeological remote sensing equipment so we can go out and find things, diving equipment, and then all the other attendant equipment to make all this work. So first, I'd like to talk about our stateside files. So these were all the sites that are found. And here we see all the site files that are housed that are for underwater archaeology. So about 2 drawerfuls, over 400 underwater archaeological sites, of which most of the majority of these sites were discovered by our hobby licensed divers, in which they go out and find sites, and then we add them to the site files. And most of these are prehistoric sites that are eroding out of the water or the riverbank, as well as colonial sites as well. Limited number of shipwrecks and other like ferry landings and other things of that nature. And again, many of these have been first encountered by our hobby licensed divers. So these files, they consist of information. So they consist of documents talking about the site themselves, and then they're added to the map, in which here you can see a bunch of sites. And then the big polygon there was a survey that was undertaken by SCIAA in the 1970s with the Corps of Engineers before they were going to do one of the initial widening and deepenings there in Charleston Harbor back in the 1980s. So these files are consulted by professional archaeologists and other researchers so that when they do have regulatory aspects, is that we know that there's sites there and can ask them if they can avoid them, or alternately, they also help us in research so that we know what sites are, and then we could sort of inspect what type of sites we might expect if we survey off a certain particular area. So another aspect of the database and site management is to create nominations to the National Register of Historic Places. So currently we have the 1 shipwreck in South Carolina on the NHRP, and that's the SS Lawrence off of Port Royal Sound. And here we can see imagery of it while it was afloat. And currently we're preparing nominations for the 2 Union stone fleets that were sunk off of Charleston as 2 separate historic districts. And so that's some of the ongoing work that we have. And the other important aspect of our job is consulting with the State Historic Preservation Office for potential development projects that may negatively or adversely affect underwater archaeological sites. And so we consult with the SHPO, and then they pass along our concerns to the governing agency, which is typically the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, with the Charleston District as well as the Savannah District. That are 2 sort of main water bodies. We deal with them. And then also there's DHEC, OCRM, and some other agencies that we'll deal with if there's going to be some impacts, potential negative impacts. And so here's a few of the projects that we've had ongoing for a little while. One of the, like I said, obviously work with the SHPO a lot, and find more information about the regulatory aspects there as well on their website. But one of the projects that we've been working on, and which you probably see daily as you travel over the various bridges, a lot of dredging going on to work on widening and deepening the Charleston Harbor for navigation for the larger ships that keep increasing in size, and trying to get in there to be tidally independent. So they don't care what the tide is, they can still get these large container ships in, and as well as maintenance as well. I mean, it's constantly stuff eroding into the various slopes, and they got to keep cleaning it. So this, as you may have known, is the post 45, and we were intimately involved with that, at least from the submerged cultural resource side, of trying to determine that they were not going to, again, impact a shipwreck or anything else of archaeological historical importance. And here we see a graphic showing the channel toe, where they would be widening, and that would also then be where they would do the survey, to remote sensing survey. We'll see some of those types of instruments that were used. And so, you know, we review what they find. And in this case here, we see in the upper left is a magnetic anomaly. So something ferrous material, iron or steel, was found. So here's a potential thing that may be of archaeological historical significance. And then the bottom right, you can see the side scan sonar, which is acoustically pictured, the bottom that shows a scatter of material. And then we would recommend, you know, avoidance. You know, can you avoid this target, or do you have to go through it? In this case, they have to go through it because that's it's in the line of the survey area. And in this case, it was just found to be modern debris. So then this would be sort of most likely clamshelled up and out of the way. But we always put the caveat that if you do determine or encounter archaeological materials, that you would contact our office as well as the SCIAA, and then for further guidance on what would be necessary, you know, additional archaeological work or what have you. Or, you know, this appears to be some modern debris. Can we just remove it to another area perhaps? And so through some of these clamshell digs, they did encounter magnetic anomalies that were detected, but then determined to be modern debris, and which in case actually turned out to be anchors. So in the upper left one, you see an anchor that's not terribly historic, but is about, you know, say mid to late 1800s in age, if not a little bit or younger than that. And then to the bottom right, you see a modern Danforth anchor. And so these anchors were recovered and then deposited off of Drum Island, where the Corps maintains sort of a disposal area. So they'll just drop material there. We get the coordinates. So if we ever did want to go back, we should be able to locate those targets again. Another potential adverse impact is the beach renourishment projects that go onto shore to renourish the beaches, so people can walk on the beach, keep the beach there for protection as well, of course, for the homes and property that are along the beach. But the borrow sites, as they're called, are offshore. So they're underwater, you know, mile or so offshore. And so again, they have the potential to impact shipwrecks and other archaeological sites. And so again, we would require a submerged cultural resource survey to take place prior to starting to cutter head dredge and pumping that sand ashore. And so here off of Folly Beach, you can see some of these borrow sites, A, B, C, D, and actually you see the nautical line. So some of this is in state water, and then some of this is in federal water. And in the federal water, they deal with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, with the Minerals Department, and then they coordinate with the SCIAA as well, which then gives us a little bit of guidance to say, yes, there should be a cultural resource survey to take place there. And so this case, we did require one, and really they're just interested in what's called BQS, or beach quality sands. They don't want to just pump up anything. They want good sand to bring ashore. And so here we see this donut-shaped trapezoid or some type of figure there, in which they only did the survey blocks on the perimeter and didn't mess with that interior area. And so during that survey with the magnetometer, they detected a single anomaly, which then corresponded to a side scan sonar image there. So you can see SSS0001 was a side scan sonar target, but it was determined to be probably some modern debris, and then hence no buffer zone was put around it to protect it. On another previous survey area in that general area, there was found a shipwreck, and so there we put like 100-yard buffer zone around it so that the cutter head wouldn't damage the site and all. So it's typically the preferred method is avoidance, but again, sometimes you can't avoid it. You have to deal with it. And that'll be and speaking of not avoiding it, we well, hold on a minute, I'm getting ahead of myself. So as I mentioned, the BOEM, or Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is getting more into of managing the outer continental shelf. So as I mentioned, from 3 nautical miles out is federal waters, and so they were the ones that managed that. But in that outer continental shelf out to the big cliff, the abyssal cliff, each state is apportioned a part of this area. And so here we see South Carolina's area in red. And again, each of the federal agencies will consult with the SCIAA, which then again, as we get involved in this process as well. But two sort of projects are starting to impact these areas. The one is, you can see in the left, the wind turbines. There's only one farm off of the US coast at this timeline. That's off of New York and in between Rhode Island, powering Block Island. And so eventually these turbines are going to start coming down the shore. I think there's already been talk here of South Carolina as well. And so before any of that would, before you start planning wind farms out there, we would have to do the submerged cultural resource surveys. But BOEM's a little different versus like the Corps of Engineers. They'll go to the developers will go to the Army Corps of Engineers. They'll recommend a survey, and then they'll do it, and then they'll come back, and all the agencies will look at what was found or not found. BOEM, though, will do what they call study. So they actually on their own go out and take a look at some of these areas where they know the potential wind energy areas are, or even minerals, so the sand biosites as well. So they'll go out there and do survey and contract with various state agencies or other institutions. And so back in the mid 2000s, we were contracted with Coastal Carolina University, as well as another entity within USC to study a good windshore area off of North Myrtle Beach. And so again, they realized, all the shipwrecks, all these red dots show shipwrecks that are off the coast of South Carolina, again, could be negatively impacted by these wind energy areas and other activities. But one of the features that BOEM's really interested in as well is sort of the Paleo Landscape. So, we have the modern shoreline and then out to the abyssal plain. But during prehistoric times, till about, 18,000 or so years ago, humans could actually go out to the outer continental shelf. And so the Clovis or Paleo-Indian culture could have gone out there, and then eventually as sea levels rise, they get pushed back to about the Archaic Age. And then after that, the coastline looks roughly like it does today. And so folks have thought, well, there could be evidence of these prehistoric habitations. Where would you look for them? Well, some of the best places are along relic river channels that would have gone out to the abyssal plain. And here we see this you see in red here, in the red block, one of these channels off of Charleston, 30, 40 miles offshore. And then the inset, again, just showing it a little better. And so, there's the realization of the transgression. How violent was it? And so here in the bottom right, you see scoured surface. So that the waves really churn that area up. So probably, it's low probability that preservation of a habitation site would be there. But if you get up into these more defined features, there is the potential that prehistoric material has been found. And maybe in your readings and all in the news, past few years off of Florida, they had a more gradual sea level rise there, and they've been able to find shell midden sites of prehistoric folks, eating shellfish. There was also a graveyard in the Archaic period that was off of, I believe, Naples, or on the west coast of Florida's the area I'm talking about. So there is the potential for this prehistoric material surviving ocean sea level rise. And so, like I said, in the mid 2000s, we engaged with BOEM and the three entities with Coastal and USC to do a study of this area. And we didn't find any shipwrecks, but we did determine that there was some potential evidence of preservation of prehistoric landscape. So that would be to be investigated in the future. And if, say, a contract firm wanted to set up a wind energy area and set up a wind farm, they would have to do further study on these two facets. So our third act responsibility, again, as a minister of the South Carolina Underwaters and Antiquities Act. And that really focuses on our two licenses, Addison, I've mentioned the hobby licenses and then exclusive licenses. So this is exclusive licenses is if you want to get more commercial in nature. So the hobby licenses, you would contract with our office and set up to get a hobby license, and could be good for 6 months or 2 years. And for that privilege with the license, you would need to report to us every quarter, so every 3 months, your findings. And so a lot of folks go diving with their friends and recover, various historic materials, such as left there with the pipe fragment, bowl fragment, upper right, a nice prehistoric point. And down to the bottom, what most people are really wanting to collect is shark's teeth and fossils. We're very rich in underwater paleontology. So the Cooper River down to the Beaufort area is very rich with artifacts and fossil collecting. And that's really what a lot of folks use their hobby license for. But again, not adverse to picking up a historic material as well. And again, as I mentioned, they'd have to report their findings. The artifacts go to us as the archaeology side of things, and then paleontological materials go to the South Carolina State Museum with Dave Chichi Murray. And I hope at some point he'll be able to give you all a presentation talking about his side of the hobby license, as well as paleontology in general in South Carolina. But really, one of the main aspects is also the exclusive licenses. So folks believe, they can recover material from shipwrecks, especially gold, but those are usually a little further offshore, especially think of Central America that's been recovered over a number of years. But really what the exclusive license has been used, especially since my time when I arrived here in the late 90s, is to use to recover historic submerged logs, or people call them sinker logs or deadhead logs. So these were logs that were cut down. Really the ones they're really looking for from the late 1700s that were axe cut cypress logs, as well as then later on pine tree logs that were cut down, floated down the river, and then sank along the way. And then people figure they can go out and recover them. We issue the license as archaeological material because they have been modified by humans. Both ends have typically been cut. You also have evidence of the naval stores industry, in which for the pine trees, they're cutting for sap, in which we call them cat faces, and they'll show various evidence of that. And then, of course, the cypress logs are the ones they really like, because those typically have been axe cut and suggest an older age, and they're usually typically big, and they really like that fine-grained wood. And that's what sort of the selling point has been, underwater, aging for 200 years or so underwater. And so here you can see some evidence of that. So the bottom left, or the left one, is showing chevron cut, or a cat face as it called. So the turpentiners would cut it and then put a bowl down at the bottom, and the sap would run down and they'd collect that. And here we see a big cypress log in the process of being cut. And so the state could, get some monetary funds from this, but for the most part, what we want is just really the archaeological manifestation. So the cut marks, as well as a nice cat face or two, and then to conserve them, which is typically air drying them, and then giving them to a local cultural or natural institution that would like to show them. So the one that they're cutting here with that big gigantic chainsaw is cut in half. It had some nice axe marks, as well as some other axe or saw marks as well. And this was reserved and is on display, or at least at the South Carolina Maritime Museum. So that's sort of what our in-kind type of contribution that the loggers give to us as well. And so typically, they use it for flooring, roofing, tables. A lot of tables are made, and furniture. And then some people also use the wood for furniture making as well. And so really, it's people think you can get pretty rich doing this, but for the most part, a lot of these guys have found out they really got to hustle the material to sell it. But so we got probably about 2 or 3 real active loggers that are doing this here in the state, primarily in the Waccamaw River, as being a nice black water river that's really preserved the logs real well. So, yep. Another aspect of our of the legislation, as I mentioned, as the fossils. So we really are the go-between between an applicant and, say, the state museum if they're more interested in paleontological finds. And so we'll also help the state museum if, you know, a find has been determined that it should be recovered and retained by the state, and then some form of compensation worked out with the finder. So in this case, to the left, we're recovering a mammoth femur that was located in the Ashepoo River, is discovered by one of our hobby licensees who reported the find. And then after a series of negotiations, we recovered the mammoth. And here you can see the bottom right is the bone, big femur bone that was recovered, or actually it could be the tibia as well. I'm not a paleontologist, but so we've recovered maybe about 20% of the mammoth, and that's been currently conserved at the State Museum, and hopefully we'll go on display as I plan on revamping their exhibit here shortly. So our aspect, and one of the best parts of the job, is conducting archaeological research. So sometimes, you know, we can choose a wreck that we're interested in or a time period, or other times we have to respond to a project that's being handed to us in case of the Hunley. When that was discovered, we sort of then continued on with that until the point where they then hired the folks who are working there that are specifically devoted to the Hunley. And again, you know, all types of other projects that arise through us. And so I'd like to first talk just, you know, some of the equipment that we use. So we have a 26-foot aluminum boat that is our research vessel. So that's our multi-purpose vessel. We use that primarily in the ocean and bays and a river if we need to. But this was what we use for our marine remote sensing surveys, as well as diving off as well. And here we just see the various array of guidance systems to help us navigate the boat in straight lines from point A to point B, and then just move over typically anywhere from 15 meters to 20 meters. And we call that mowing the lawn, just sort of going back and forth anywhere from 1.5 miles to 2 mile lane, and then just move over and keep doing that back and forth, as well as a Humminbird sonar and our other equipment. And here's sort of one of our screen readouts of the magnetometer. So as I mentioned, that detects ferromagnetic material. So think anchors, cannons, rigging, even ballast pile of a colonial vessel might show a little bit of magnetic interference. But you can see to the left is what we call a dipole. So it went from negative to positive. So you can then over to the other screen, you can see what it looks like as we're moving our boat along the transect. And so this is a small anomaly, and it's probably just a single object. When we have more multi-components, we call a lot of material going on, as well as impacting 2 or 3 lanes, that would suggest something more, possibly more archaeological important. Although, of course, if it's a big, large, modern object, such as a battleship, that whole area would be, you know, lit up for like 10, 20 lanes or so or more. And here, just a close-up of how we determine what's negative and positive, and this would be a multi-component anomaly. So it's a little more activity going on. And when we did dive this to investigate it, it turned out to be like an older pontoon that would have been used to support a dredge pipe. So not terribly important, but it was, you know, probably early 1900s was when that dredge pipe was used off of Port Royal Sound. And again, the acoustic aspects, very important, the side scan sonar. So we use the magnetic data and then and complemented by acoustic data, which we picture the bottom. So anything exposed above the bottom will show up. And so here the boat is moving along, and we got a big ballast pile. This is off of Morris Island, in which you can see the rocks, and then also some scatter there in the upper part that turned out to be some anchor chain and other aspects. So between the 2 data sets, we can determine if it's worth investigating. And another tool, if it's buried, so you still get a magnetic anomaly, but you can't see it, is we use a sub-bottom profiler. So that's shooting a very small acoustic wave down below the sediments. And so that top area with the red and the greens and all is your surface. And then you can see the white line which is over this area here. So something's protruding above the floor about 6 feet, 8 feet below grade. And this was a Confederate transport vessel that was accidentally fired upon at at Charleston Harbor and sank. So it's a little out towards the jetties and is buried about 10 feet under the sand actually. And then, but really the best remote sensing equipment is going down there with your eyes and hands and figuring out what's there. So in this case, we'll use a metal detector. We also have a handheld proton magnetometer as well to try and determine what these things are and how much effort we have to figure out what they are. Another aspect of all this, and some of actually the first things we would do, would be conducting historical research. And so, we take any opportunity we can to learn more about South Carolina history and documents that would help us from an archaeological viewpoint as well. And so we went up to a conference in Boston a few years ago, took the opportunity to go to the Massachusetts Historical Society that has a lot of Civil War material with a lot of the Union soldiers coming from Massachusetts. And so here we see the Massachusetts Historical Society, and then the bottom right showing, sort of the little layout, nice reading room that was modeled on the National Archives reading room. And then the upper left here, we see a nice little watercolor image of a Union gunboat, probably around Rockport there near Johns Island or so. And then you can see Charleston sort of burning in the background with firing and all going on there. So some of the projects that we've worked on, besides projects that we would do on our own, we also coordinate with other agencies. So with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, they have the responsibility of managing the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center there in Winyah Bay. So it expands over North and South Island. And so they got some monies from the Hurricane Irma Relief Fund when it passed by, I believe it was 2017 or thereabouts, and caused a lot of erosion. And so DNR got money to go look at what were potential negative impacts to historical sites eroding out of the shore. And so we spent time with Dr. Jody Barnes, who's there at the crest of the sandbar, documenting sites, and we found some historic ceramics, whiteware, so maybe early 1800s ceramics, and we document the site. And then over to the left, we also went along with the John boat on areas that we couldn't walk, such as those intertidal and tidal fringes of the islands, and look for material as well. And here we see some in the middle of that right image is we see some, unidentified metal objects poking out. So we just sort of document them, and, if she wanted to go look at them later, perhaps we'd help her on that as well. So that was about a 2-week venture that we spent with them. Another aspect, we've done a lot of work with the Civil War, and that's really been sort of what I've spent a lot of time on is Civil War off of Charleston Harbor. But again, Winyah Bay has it, Port Royal Sound as well. But here we see an image of one of the ironclads off of Charleston Harbor. The USS Patapsco was the second generation monitor. So after the original famous monitor, this was the second generation, beefing them up, enlarging them, making them more ship-shaped, at least underwater. And it would be able to go up into the throat of the harbor, Charleston Harbor, and duke it out with Fort Sumter, and then with Fort Moultrie and all the sand batteries that were protecting Charleston during the Confederates, during the Civil War and the Confederate side. And to the right there, you can see the side scan sonar image of the remains of the Patapsco. It struck they called them a torpedo, but really a mine. Struck it, sank within 15 minutes. Half the crew perished with the Patapsco. And so we can see the bow of the vessel down there at the lower area. And then there was a dredge pipe that's draped across it, which is unfortunate, but actually it turned out to be all right because it's sort of a highway and a marker for us to know where we were on the wreck. And then if you move further back towards the stern, and all the wrecks from the Civil War have been heavily salvaged. So the Patapsco, everything, the pilot house here, the turret, the armor belting, all that's been recovered, the machinery. So really we're not left with too much other than the very lowest part of the hull. We've also recovered guns from the CSSPD that were jettisoned during the waning days of the Civil War as Sherman's troops were moving up across the Great Petey River near Cheraw. They scuttled the gunboat and then threw jettisoned the cannons into the river, and people have been looking for those for years. And so we recovered the 3 of them in 2015. They were conserved at the Warren Last Conservation Center, the same place that the Hunley is being conserved at. And then now if you go to Florence on your way to Myrtle Beach, perhaps you could stop between the VA building and the Florence National Cemetery, and shown here on the right, and see the three cannons, which were two Confederate Brooke rifled cannons, and then the one beyond, pointed towards the cemetery, was a captured Dahlgren 9-inch cannon. So they have interesting histories, and you can learn more about those, you know, if you go to the museum at the Florence County Museum there in Florence. Another project that we work with is, as I was mentioning, sometimes people bring projects to us or would like us to be incorporated in the project. And here the U.S. Coast Guard was interested in finding two wrecks of their early revenue cutters that sank off in Charleston, or actually in Charleston Harbor. And so here we see a ceremony for the wreck of the U.S. revenue cutter Gallatin that exploded during the War of 1812 right off of the waterfront park. So if you're at the old Exchange building and looked out towards the Cooper River, that's about the rough spot of where the Gallatin wrecked. And they've also put a plaque here that depicts or describes some of the activities of the Coast Guard here in Charleston over the years. And so we worked with them. As actually an old classmate of mine, who's the historian for the Coast Guard, was interested in finding these two wrecks. So he engaged with us and then brought us together with elements of the Coast Guard that could assist us on this project. And so, as I mentioned, so here's where the Gallatin, so here's the old Exchange building. And then if you come out roughly the street out to shore would be where the wreck occurred. And one thing we can immediately see is the waterfront has accreted. So Bay Street used to be the waterfront, and then it's just accreted over the years. And that red mark shows the old wharf area. And so we can see that that's now underground. And also the park comes out a little further, as well as some other old piling areas as well. So that's one of the theories, is that the wreck could be buried under the ground, or I think based on the nautical charts of the time, is it could be a little further offshore. So in any case, we surveyed the area with our magnetometer, and you can see that there's quite a bit of a magnetic nightmare material, all sorts of debris that would obscure the wreck if it was there. And so it also helpfully showed that there were some type of rock mounds as well. And so that's what the sonar here is showing, one of these rock mounds. So it's possible the wreck could be one of these rock mounds, or it's just rubble. And so we worked with the Charleston County Sheriff's Department police dive team, as well as with the city police dive team, to investigate the targets. But unfortunately, we didn't really get too much information during those dives. And so in an attempt to try and get more information on those sites, the East Coast Dive Locker team from the Coast Guard came in and brought this ROV that could sort of scan the area with side scan sonar and take pictures. But unfortunately, the visibility was terrible, so the camera didn't really show us anything, and the side scan sonar just again showed us that, you know, the rocks are there. We know that. So we'll have to probably go dive that in the future to try and figure out, you know, exactly what is it? Is it just rubble, or is it potentially a shipwreck or potential interest? So again, it's not all shipwrecks or historic materials. That's really, though, my forte. But we work also with our colleagues, our terrestrial colleagues here at SCIAA and any other organization that would like us to investigate eroding sites. So, you know, they're interested in the land, and we'll go out into the river and to see if we can't sort of bridge the two together. And that was the case here with Dr. Al Goodyear. You can see in the upper left in the woods, the Savannah River was running real high. And so we're sort of diving amongst the trees. We see my colleague Ryan there talking to him, and he would go down, and we're trying to find evidence of the Chert quarry. And so this is where Paleo Indians especially would have been coming to Allendale County along this bluff to recover this material here of chert. And you can see in the upper left, or excuse me, the upper right, that real nice caramelized chert, in which they make some real beautiful points out of the nice Clovis long points. And so this was the raw material that they were looking for. And usually then you could find evidence of them working it as well. And so that's what we were doing here in this little creek. And again, to the right, you can see a sort of a flake as they sort of break it down to a core, which they can either work there or perhaps bring with them on the trail and just keep making points as they went along their travels. And then again, here we work with Dr. Chester Pratt, a SCIAA colleague as well. We're looking for a Yamasi site. So this would have been a historic a period tribe that had sort of amalgamated, being after they've been displaced by the English and the Spanish in the early 1600s. They form a new tribe, and they live up in the upper Port Royal Sound area. And this is off the Combahee River. They sort of moved around here and there, but there's an Indian village that Chester was interested in finding. And so could we find where the habitation site was on the bluff by going into the water and perhaps finding a plume of artifacts that were being brought downstream the site. And so this, unfortunately, our GoPro was a little cloudy that day, but it did show that we could go along the bottom, find these prehistoric Yamasee specific type of pottery, and we were able to track down to where it finally fizzled out. And then we came back upshore, figured out where it stopped, and then we're able to, sort of look at where the main concentration was, and then look towards the shore. And at a beautiful rise on the bluff was where that main material was. So that suggested that was where the Native American site was. Unfortunately, Chester got denied permission by the private landowner to dig it to confirm it, but at least we got a good general location of where this Native American habitation site was. And again, just some of the material that we collected. So most of it just sitting up on the surface on the marl bottom, and sometimes we could hand fan a little bit of sand as well to recover some of the material. But one of our most current projects we're working on right now is off of Port Royal Sound, so off of Beaufort. Hopefully you can see my cursor, Beaufort over here, the Marine Corps Air Station, Parris Island, Hilton Head over here. And so we've been looking for shipwrecks dating from the 16th century on up to more modern times. And one of the wrecks that we're really looking for is Le Prince. It was a 16th century French corsair that wrecked in either in the winter of 1576 or early 1577 there at the entrance to Port Royal Sound. And it is successfully raided and traded in the Spanish Indies, West Indies, as well as along the Spanish Main, along Venezuela and Brazil, and traveled through the Caribbean, attacking shipping and towns as well, and then wrecked off of Port Royal Sound. And so we've been really interested in trying to find that wreck, as well as 30 other wrecks that we know of. So in our efforts to find the shipwreck, we've contracted with various historical researchers. In this case, this is showing some Spanish archival documents. Typically, they're the governors, royal governors, writing back to the king, tell him what's going on. In this case, a lot of the content of this documents are related to Le Prince and what it's doing. So again, good helping us build the historical context for the shipwreck, and hopefully also providing clues of where it actually wrecked. And here we also contracted with Dr. Bernard Allaire, who worked in the French archives, because the ship was a French vessel. So could we get more information about this vessel as it prepared for this voyage in 1576? And here we see one of these ledger books, of which it was a notary public. And so they're called tabillons. So they're sort of a cross between a notary public and a lawyer at this time in France. And so they would write up the contracts between the various captains and the crew, getting together the charter party, who'd be responsible for what and this and that. And so Bernard just goes through these documents from that time period and helps to find Le Prince listed. And so he's been able to find, using this material, back to the mid-1570s. And then we've done some more archival research down in La Rochelle, in which he found even more evidence of Le Prince back in the 1560s. So we've got a lot of good information. We just need to find the wreck to really bridge the archaeology and the history together. Other wrecks, again, most of them are of colonial period. They weren't even going to Port Royal. They were going either to Savannah or going to Charleston, and a storm pushed them onto the shoals and wrecked. And so this case, this is an advertisement to salvage materials from one of the wrecks that occurred in the 1780s, actually during the Revolutionary War, but was actually just passing through and wrecked. So again, about 30 historically recorded wrecks in this area. And then another helpful image showing during the Civil War that there's a wreck up there in the breaker. So those are always nice to have a map showing you where things are. And again, that Lawrence that I mentioned earlier, That was wrecked in 1890s, late 1890s during a winter storm, going to Savannah, loaded with a bunch of material, and wrecked. Some of the crew died because it was so cold as they made it ashore. Today, it's just during low tide, a part of the wreck is exposed. Some of my earlier colleagues aboard the ship there at low tide, and still visible all these years later. But early hobby licensed divers went out there and collected material. And to the left, you can see some Hines preserves, still very well packed. Apparently, Mr. Hines, wanted things very neatly, and here we can see that. To the middle, a doll that's missing the cloth parts, and then to the right, some very valuable material back during COVID, some toilet paper rolls. So you can just see how excellent the preservation is out there. So typically, if a wreck can get buried below the mud and into the anaerobic area, below where biology can occur, organics can be very well preserved. There's still chemical decomposition going on, but if you can get it below the mud line, a lot of things can be preserved for centuries, if not millennia as well. And here's a side scan sonar image of the wreck as well. So the middle area, that square area, is probably where the boiler was. And today, though, as we can see in this image that was taken last year, all we can really see is where that boiler was. It's completely sanded over. So the shoals, shift and change. They still, retain the rough orientation, even back to the 16th century. But, individually they change. And so we consider that in our survey as well. So here's a few objects that we found on the sonar. We knew they were modern, but we just wanted to discount them as anything of importance. And so we dove them. And so one of these turned out to be some type of mooring system, or at least parts of it. And my colleague Amber diving on it. And then to the right, another object turned out to be a big tank. And to the right, here's a wreck. Looked like a shrimp boat at first with that nice square stern. But when we investigated it again, here's a new sonar image of more sand. Again, sand is accreted over it. And we found out it was more it was a workboat, but maybe more of a tourist type. It had sort of rounded guards around it and all, an engine as well. So not 100% sure what it is. I'll do a little more investigation to determine, what it is. But again, a modern wreck and not too terribly interesting from our viewpoint. So here's that big survey area that we've done. We've almost completely surveyed our initial area where we believe LaPrince wrecked, and we've expanded outwards as well. And so we're working on a NOAA Ocean Exploration Research grant in this further out area, and are just methodically going back and forth. And so this is about where we are today. Next week, we go back out to refine magnetic and acoustic targets to get a little more information about them. And then we'll prioritize those to see which ones we want to dive. And we'll plan on diving in mid-October for a week on the sites, try and figure out if we found shipwrecks or is it just modern debris. Another aspect that we deal with on a constant basis is people finding things, on the beach or in the rivers. In this case, this is a fragment of a prehistoric canoe that was recovered in the Savannah River. And we know it's prehistoric versus historic is if you look in the body of or in the interior there of the canoe, you can see char marks. And so while it could have burned at some point, but more than likely it was the evidence of the burn and scrape method prehistoric folks would have used to burn and then scrape, burn, scrape until they fashion that canoe how they like. So again, a fragment, but still evidence of Native American usage on the riverways. And so public interaction is, again, a real key point of our work. We try and disseminate the information through our newsletter, SCIAA newsletter that's available online, reports as well. We also go out to engage with the public at field days and fall festivals and things. In this case, this was a Coastal Discovery Museum in which we set up our boat to sort of mimic us being offshore. And so we're able to discuss all the various instruments that we have on the dash, and then also a little more, typical display of talking about our work and what we do. Of course, I invite you to look at our webpage, in which we have a lot of material about our work, as well as, of course, dealing with the hobby licenses as well. And most of our reports are available online as well this way. And of course, social media, in which Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as well. We also featured, which was fun, with the National Geographic's Drain the Ocean TV series, in which we're on season 3, and I forget the actual episode number. So if y'all have streamed Disney Plus, I would invite you to look at Drain Raiders of the Civil War, in which we feature for about 15 minutes talking about our work on the Charleston Harbor stone fleets that were sunk by the Union in 2 separate areas off of Morris Island, as well as Isle of Palms. And so it was real fun working with them on that. That was about a couple years ago now. And I would also encourage you, an upcoming event that's coming on is the Archaeos Film Festival, which deals with archaeology, both on land and underwater. And so it'll run through October 10th through 16th. And I can send a link to that, or you can just Google that. And three of the films will sort of have an underwater theme to them. The Progetto Albanus is about a Roman engineering off of Rome, like draining the Lake Alban, and how they go about that. And then the archaeologist and folks sort of investigating. It's more of a speleological, spelunkers doing it, but it is a little bit underwater going on. To the middle is the recovery of some cannons that were recovered off the Savannah River that were from the Revolutionary War. And so again, Savannah is also enlarging its navigation channel. So they came across these cannons, of about 14 or 15 of them. And so they've been recovered and being conserved in eventual display. And it's just a little short movie, about 7 minutes. And to the right, probably the more interesting one is The Mystery of the Costco Cave, of a diver who dove like 90 feet underwater, finds a cave, worms his way through this cave, pops up into an air pocket, comes ashore in there, and finds paleo drawings, from, I guess, Cro-Magnon, early human paintings and drawings and all. So it's a real fascinating film. So I would encourage you all to take a look at those films, as well as others as well. So, but before I conclude, I just wanted to, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them before I conclude. Addison?
Yes, sir. First of all, I just want to apologize for mispronouncing your name. Hopefully, you don't take away my license for that. So
we'll put it under a microscope now, I guess.
Yes, but are there any questions from the audience? Yes. Can you hear me if I just talk? Can you just hear me if I? Yeah. To what extent is the National Park Service involved in any artifacts found around Fort Sumter?
Well, either you know something, or it's funny that you asked that.
I was just curious.
Well, they actually are going in mid-October. They're going to, for a couple of weeks, come and dive around Fort Sumter. I don't know if they're going to Fort Moultrie as well, but Fort Sumter, with that widening and deepening harbor, they're, worried about, accelerated currents as well as wake that could negatively impact Fort Sumter. And so what they plan on doing is putting a breakwater around the channel side of the fort. And so before they do that, though, they want to investigate the footprint of where the breaker will be. And they want to look for, all the Civil War shot that was fired at Fort Sumter, probably the most metal hurled at a single, structure in many years. And so they want to investigate that. And so that would be all federal property on that. So yeah, Park Service is heavily involved in, Park Service lands. And then if there's sort of multi-jurisdiction between the state and the feds, we would both, work out an agreement on how we would deal with any artifacts or shipwrecks or whatever found.
I have a question. When you spoke about the 2 anchors that you found, and then you said y'all would dispose of them off of Drum Island, did you mean back in the water? And if so, why would y'all put them back in the water after y'all find them?
Well, they were all, when the clamshell picked them up and then dumped them onto the barge, we had them, then the the salvage or the dredgers would then inform the Army Corps of Engineers, who would then inform us of what was found. And then we asked them to document the anchors. So they were all documented, but since they weren't like terribly historic, they were removed to Drum Island, off of Drum Island. So there's like a sandbar that protrudes out, and the Corps of Engineers over a number of years have just deposited, more modern debris. And actually we've deposited a few cannons there as well. So we put them in there, they sink down in the mud a little bit, and then we get the coordinates so we can go back to find them if necessary. And really that's, again, cost saving measure. To try and conserve everything that's found would be, cost prohibitive. And so this is just an easy way to keep them in the environment from which they came, but out of the way as well.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
And I'll give you guys his contact information if you have any questions. I'm sure he has no qualms against that. Any further questions? Well, I'll give you guys this information as well as the South Carolina Museum Commission's information. Mr. Dave hasn't got back to me. I haven't been in contact with him for a while now. I'll try and notify him, and maybe he'll hopefully have the time to come speak to us soon. But well, thank you so much. Sorry, and I guess I'll record this. Do you mind if we post this recording? If I send it to our members, and I'll send it to you too if you wish.
Yeah. Well, I just had a little concluding statement, if you would, but I'll also try to encourage Dave to, get in contact with you again.
I know he's pretty busy, but
yeah, no, he's got a few things on his plate, but so just in conclusion, we have a rich and important maritime archaeological repository, reflecting the maritime archaeological legacy that resides in and along the lakes, rivers, and coastal waters of South Carolina. And so this archaeological record is, just as important as the paper record that's housed at the State Historic Preservation Office. Gives us, instead of just simply the written record, we got the archaeological record, the physical representations of the development of South Carolina, primarily through maritime trade and development of how South Carolina progressed and moved up from, not only historic times, but of course, Native Americans as well. And, and then sometimes in very rare cases, you have the crew themselves, such as the 8 members aboard the H.L. Hunley were recovered and, investigated to some degree and then reburied. And so again, just, gives a testimony to how important the development of South Carolina as well as a nation is reflected in these archaeological sites. And so it's up to us as the stewards, so as the managers, hobby licensees, other federal and state agencies, general public, to protect and preserve these underwater archaeological sites, because pretty much we consider them non-renewable. We're not going to get another 16th century French shipwreck. We're not going to get other Civil War shipwrecks, colonial vessels, and whatever. And so, while there are federal and state laws that preserve it, it's really up to people to say, this should, we should preserve these. And so that's part of really what we want to do is, foster an awareness and appreciation of these maritime archaeological resources, also engage them as not only for their scientific purposes, but also recreational purposes as well, as sport divers diving on these sites and learning about what's going on. And of course, just preserving them for future generations to come. So again, Addison and all, thank you for your attention, and presume I may present again at some point in the future, but thanks, and y'all have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.